And away we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claude. All right, over to you.
Okay, thanks. And my apologies for whatever my computer decided to do today. As John mentioned, I usually am on a webinar a couple times a week. But anyways, let's get on with estimating and costing. So basically what I wanted to talk about certainly is a little bit about estimating and costing. And when we take a look at it, it really requires a good understanding of, and I'm just going to turn my video off here so I don't distract myself. Hopefully that doesn't do anything bad. Okay, so we need to have a good understanding of the project scope, some history, and certainly some idea of the current pricing. In this webinar, we're really going to talk about the higher level of this topic. So when we take a look at costing and estimating, I basically have put a little bit of an agenda here together so we can kind of basically, okay, now what's happening? There we go. Estimating and costing, are they the same thing? In my opinion, there's certainly some subtle differences. And what are those differences? What we want to do is talk about, construction estimating is the act of calculating the cost of construction projects, if we're referring to construction projects. And pretty much that's what we're going to talk about in this session. However, costing can also imply taking an expected expenditure and taking a deeper look at it when we get into the fact of what is the true cost of a project. Certainly, there's a lot of upfront costs, but there's a lot of costs that kind of follow behind the build. So what we're going to do is take a look at things such as what about ongoing maintenance, modifications, and servicing costs. So again, estimating one sort of costs, the overall costs, kind of a different picture. So when we take a look at this, there are many factors that affect a building cost. So in order to really identify some of those major cost factors, what we need to do is really take a look at what do those things comprise of. So estimates are dependent on some of these main factors. Certainly materials, labor in reference to the work or the work that needs to be performed, the equipment, the overhead and profit, and certainly what about financing? What money is involved? How's that money going to be handled and treated? So to a builder or contractor, estimation is part of an ongoing process of collecting data and being able to determine with reasonable precision the cost to build something, to put it together. At best, in reference with reasonable frequency, often used, hopefully, is past historical information, the data from, let's say, previous projects, hopefully not too dated. Well, what's the primary purpose of estimating and costing? So when we take a look at that particular slide, we start talking about estimating is about cost, as I indicated. So it'll be our starting point. This step is essential and one of the most crucial in the bid to construction build process. Estimators need to be accurate as possible because profit margins nowadays sometimes can be slim. And in some cases, if it's very competitive, can be almost nothing, negligible, in order to maybe get the work. So it depends on, we'll say, the conditions in the marketplace at the time. What we also want to think about too is when we're doing estimating is certainly that everything is included. We don't want to get into the serious situation of what happens if there's cost overruns if you're the builder, and or the fact from the owner's perspective, the failure for the completion of a project. So anecdotal, as a point of interest in my varied experience, one of my former roles with a general contractor that I worked with, often what he liked to do was go for what we would call the low bid. We want to win almost every project. And one of my jobs, one of the roles that I played with my background was looking at the missing parts. Where are the loopholes in the contract documents? For example, in one project, the sewer connection between the library and the municipal road had totally been overlooked by the architect. Well, we knew right away we had a big loophole here of which we were going to get some extra money to do this work down the road. And of course, charge at a reasonably exorbitant fee. On another government project, we were doing a minimum security prison in Ontario. We received almost $1 million in extras. I think that well then took care of the overhead and the profit. So just a few anecdotal points I just thought that might catch your interest, and certainly a little bit amusing. So when we think about this, it really is, as I mentioned, about construction costs, direct, indirect, loopholes, and certainly that's not the primary focus here. It just widening the idea of there are a lot of things that go into estimating and certainly costing. So estimates are all about cost. How about the influences of costs? So when we think about that particular factor, I guess, we're looking at things such as the scope and definition of the work. What's required? How well is it put together? As I indicated earlier, if there's little loopholes, certainly contractors might look for it, or builders might look for it to try and say, well, if I go in low, I expect I'm going to get some money down the road because this part was overlooked. Certainly project size has a bearing. To build a small house or an addition is a lot different than building, let's say, a larger building such as a community center. And how about the complexity of the project? So again, I kind of focus here with a few points about clear quality drawings and specs. The contract documents are pretty critical, certainly when it comes to estimating. So if there's vagueness, certainly it can result in higher bids from contractors because they want to err on the side of safety. Likewise, if they're poorly documented, this can lead to unexpected costs to the owner down the road. So estimates simply provide stepping stones to providing a bid, and a bid hopefully to win a project. A base estimate covers all the estimated costs of a project apart from those unforeseen things such as we're experiencing now, escalation in material costs. Not just labor costs. You know, sometimes that happens, but certainly material costs are kind of getting heavy-handed when we look at the price of materials such as lumber. And it's just not lumber itself. It's in general most materials. You'll notice at the bottom I talk about uniformat. Its name is trademarked, the TM symbol there. It's a publication of the CSI and the constructor sector, and is a method of arranging construction information based on functional elements or parts of a facility characterized by their function. So we're going to take a short look at those and really get a general idea of what I was talking about when we talk about uniformat. So here's an example of a uniformat breakdown, and it's just a slide that depicts only part of the whole big picture. You'll notice that in the first level, it says major groups or the main elements. And if we kind of take a quick look through, it starts with the ground up approach, the substructure, the shell, the interior, the services, the furnishings, and any special things that go into the project. If we take a look at a breakdown, for example, of the substructure, well, things like footings and foundations. And what about the basement or a crawl space? And we get into level 3. Is it a standard foundation? Is it a special foundation? Is it slab on grade? And so on. So again, another sub breakdown. So we can see that there are main elements, groups, and certainly individual elements, what I would call the items. As an estimator, quite often we would use a format such as this. And it also can form as a checklist. Now, would I use this on residential? No, but it certainly is recommended for larger construction projects. Next, we're going to take a look at a sample house estimate. And again, this is just simply a sample. And what I wanted to point out, if you take a look at it, when we take a look at, again, costs and materials and estimating, again, they're similar, but slightly different. And we'll get into those differences a little bit later. So if we take a look at this example, we see the work items listed. So permits, excavation, utilities, concrete work, foundations, plumbing, electrical, and so on. Is there a vendor involved? So for example, foundations on this particular estimate, Connie's Concrete was going to take care of that. So it's a subcontracted out part of work. So there's no labor, equipment, or materials, but we'll see over in the subcontract heading, there's a price. And there's a markup by the general contractor or contractor, and it's all factored in together. Again, just simply an example. Again, if we take a look at, for example, something like the insulation. So under HVAC, and the next one down is insulation. That would be work performed by the contractor. So labor $3,500, materials $1,000, a subtotal of $4,500. And there was no markup put on it, but it was all factored in. So again, we can see that there is an itemized breakdown giving us some idea of cost. Well, what I would do with something like this, if it was a bid, certainly, it's required, but also I can reuse something like this, the information, the data, if it's reasonably accurate as part of my database of information. So I could figure out how much roughly the sample house costs. We can see the bottom, the totals, the markup, and so on, and then the total cost. And this gives us sort of a general idea for future projects, maybe next month, maybe a few months from now, of what things should cost for this type of, for example, sample house. So again, part of the estimators, we'll call it worksheet. So let's talk a little bit about costing. We talked, and at the beginning, it was about estimating and costing. Well, actual costs versus estimated costs. Let's talk a little bit about that. You'll see in green, I indicated estimated cost is determined before the commencement of a project. So before an owner, will say, contracts out, decides to go forward with the build, we're dealing with the estimated costs. Hopefully, if they've used something similar to the other discussion we had the other day, such as contract documents or recognized forms to either enter into an agreement or into a contract with the builder, that's at the point in which we're going from the estimated costs into the actual build for the construction. Well, the actual cost is known after the real completion of the work, because even though we might have an estimate, and that's what they're going to build to, and for that amount of money, the actual cost is really not completed until after the completion of the work. So what I'm going to do is basically say that's where I would, as a contractor, factor in things such as extras or changes in prices, things like that, that we may consider as the estimate was one thing, but the actual cost might be a bit more, rarely a bit less. But when we also think about the bigger picture, what is the real total cost of any project? Well, sitting back in, we'll call it the the people that are making the decision to build, we have to think about the operation, the maintenance, and the upkeep costs. And in some cases, this may even include the cost of the land, the servicing, and some of those other significant other costs that seem to sometimes get forgotten about in the big picture. So the bottom line, what is the real cost of a project? So in this case, I'm indicating that costing, when we look at the cost side of things, may be a lot different, usually will be a lot different when we consider all the costs that should be included in any project. In fact, maybe any build. So how are a few things, for example, that maybe the owners can think about minimizing costs? Well, square or rectangular homes are less expensive to build than irregular shape. A friend of mine built a roundhouse. I think it's great. It's fantastic, something different, but there's a lot of custom shape and things that have to fit into that build. A lot of special cutting. So it's not familiar to a lot of builders. And it certainly isn't going to be familiar even to, let's say, the people that have to put the tile on the floor or the finishing of the flooring or the cabinets and things like that. So how about using some standard stock materials? Again, I would assume that most places are going to follow that sort of, we'll call, idea of using standard stock materials. But there are many projects that sometimes they're not so, we'll call it standard stock. Things such as prefabricated materials. Will roof trusses be cheaper than stick framing? Well, plant labor, maybe the same cost for the actual material, but we have to think about things where we can, again, think about minimizing costs. Items such as materials such as pre-hung door saves labor. You pay a little more than if you had to put the whole, we'll say, door and door frame and the hardware all together. But if it's a pre-hung door, maybe it's the better buy. In designing to minimum codes, certainly there are people that want to build to greater than and better building standards, and that's fine too, but there's also a cost that's reflected. Minimizing custom built-ins, providing shorter runs for things such as plumbing lines and ductwork, using appropriate insulation to reduce energy costs. Avoiding construction design changes. Again, these all can factor in, and it's just a partial list of many things to consider for choices to minimize costs. Well, let's deal a little bit with the contractors and subcontractors and their estimates. Again, in my past estimating experience, you have to be careful in this area. It's necessary to determine that is the cost that you're getting from a subcontractor, someone else doing the work as part of your construction team or build team. Is it a reasonable price? Is it a reasonable cost? So I've always found, and I was trained to also do my own takeoff to use it as a point of comparison. Even if it's a general, we'll call it guesstimate of what the price I think should be, because at least I can use it as kind of a benchmark. Certainly portions of the work may be contracted or subcontracted, as we saw in that list earlier for the house, that sample house. But having several quotes from other contractors or subcontractors in this case, such as plumbing, heating, or electrical work, is likely helpful in providing you with a realistic cost determination. And you can decide to contract out that work or decide maybe if maybe that price seems a bit too high or maybe a bit too low. It's simply a point of comparison. Is your estimated cost the same? Is it more or is it less? Are there other alternatives available within the contract documents themselves? So for example, we could talk about a different type of heating system. Not so much different plumbing systems, but maybe different fixtures within the plumbing system. But really, have they really included everything? Is there anything missing that they will come back to you and say, oh, Claude, you know, when I gave you that estimate, I forgot to include this. Well, no one needs those surprises. Again, estimated costs versus actual costs. What is most important? When we think about this particular area, estimates actually provide probable costs of the work, usually before the work takes place. The bid price is a price tendered to the owner or the owner's representative. The actual cost is only known after the completion of all the work, and you might say through the life cycle of the building. In reality, they are both equally important, but for different reasons. Likewise, good estimating practices involves comparing actual costs against the estimated costs. So again, I kind of highlight the fact that there are some subtle differences between estimated costs versus actual costs. Next slide, we're going to take a look at some items of the development of a project phase, and I call it my project phase arrow. So we start with number one with the pre-design concept that goes into the design schematic stage, into a detailed design stage, and probably by number four, release documents for construction bidding, the architect, engineer, or the designer, or the owner has completed all the contract items, the documents that are going to go out for a tender or bidding. Well, number five we can see is where the estimating takes place after those documents have been released to seek out bids. In number six, there's a bid period, but at the end of it, there's what is known as, this is when the tenders or the bids are due. And what we want to do is look at who will be, well, we're going to review the bids, and certainly we have to think about the awarding of a contract. And of course, if the contract is awarded, then we get into the construction phase. And then by the end of the construction, we're now entering into the final build cost stage. So again, that cost could be determined at stage four prior to the going out to bid, or there might be design stage changes that go into and incorporated into number four before the final documents go out for the estimate. But moving along, we can see after occupancy, there'll be a long span, hopefully, of occupancy, and then moving on to post-occupancy. What happens after post-occupancy? So what we're really talking about is sort of that detailed breakdown of the project phasing. So estimating is typically part of the bidding process. Without accurate costs, a bidder can be too high or too low. Both are really undesirable. So let's go back to the estimating phase, because we're talking about estimating and costing again. So what's required? Good plans and drawings providing location and construction details. Specifications basically provide materials, installation, and issues such as we'll call it craftsmanship or workmanship, as well as the general contract conditions. So estimating requires a good understanding of the methods of measurement, as well as an understanding of the material, but also the ability to read and interpret the drawings. So location and understanding of pricing is important information based on regional cost variations. Most of you are likely aware of that in remote locations, prices are going to be probably extremely different than those that are closer to, we'll call it the big city or a closer town, or something where you can get materials a lot more readily and without a lot of additional pricing differences. But costing guidebooks, as I indicate, can be helpful, but they can be a gamble if local pricing is not considered as being factored in to what that cost guide is indicating in the cost guide book. So estimating what's required generally takes place during the bidding period, as we indicated earlier. Estimating cost data can be derived from a number of key sources. So for example, estimating requires people with good technical skills. It requires the ability to understand drawings and specifications, as well as being able to read them and really the ability to perform an accurate or reasonably accurate takeoff. And a takeoff means just item by item breakdown of everything that's required for the build. So when we start calculating materials such as a 2x4, 8 feet long, how many 2x4s are required? Are they all 8 feet long? Or are there some a little longer? And if so, at what price? So, but equally as important of obtaining an accurate takeoff of quantity is also an idea of the cost. So is a 2x4 $3.50 each? Or is it going to be the new revised price of maybe $9 each? That's a huge difference in pricing. So your material takeoff as far as quantity could be accurate, but if the price is not accurate, then it's going to be way, way too low or possibly too high. So the data can come from a number of different sources, as I indicated, such as either in-house from past data collected experiences, or in other cases by other trade prices, in other words, from other cost sources such as subcontractors, or by simply using some of these costing database guides. As you can see here, with the current material pricing in construction, it's well known today that materials have increased in price substantially across most, if not all, of Canada, well, as well as the US. So the last resort costing database guides and items such as estimating software, such as the RS Means, again, one of the bigger companies as far as costing guides are concerned, can be beneficial, but you also have to proceed with caution. Back at again with the bidding phase, this is a stage where subcontractors and contractors provide and offer a bid price for work. When we think about that, bidding or submitting a bid is a stage where contractors or suppliers are basically providing a price for a project or we'll call it a bill of work. Be it a new build, such as a house, or just simply a new heating system for housing, or a new community center, these things become pretty important as far as the bidding phase is concerned. There generally are certain risk management requirements for bids. These might include things such as insurance or bonds. As we can see here, and again, I think John has touched a little bit on the risk management part of this. We talk about hopefully competitive bidding is popular with many owners because it usually results in lower construction costs. There's a point of comparison in bids. So bidding is mandatory for most public agencies. So for example, when it comes to large construction projects, federal projects in particular, it's usually open competitive bidding. So let's deal with some bidding variables. What variables affect the bid the most? Well, as we can see here, I've listed 5: contractor's overhead and profit margin, conditions of the construction, your marketplace for the build, the cost of labor and materials, the bids from subcontractors in the location, if it's close by or is at a great distance. So again, this is kind of maybe just a review of what we covered so far, but these are certainly some things that can impact price or the cost for a bid. What are the key points regarding bid conditions? Well, when we talk about bid conditions, we want to make sure in order to receive good or fair bids, we need a lot of information. It must be clearly stated in terms and conditions for the bid. What type of bid is it? Is it a unit price, specified price? Is it simply labor and material? Is there some other type of bid that they're actually bidding on, and in what type of format? Recommended use of industry standards. And again, we touched on that last week, the CCDC bid and contract forms, or I like to, in some case, use a modified derivative. Again, using design bid, when we think about large projects, CCDC makes a lot of sense. But when we think about something such as, let's say, a house, a build for a house, we don't necessarily need a CCDC document. Yeah, we could use it, but maybe it's a little bit of, we'll call heavy weighted for, let's say, a simpler contract form. It also requires an understanding of the build site and conditions. So quite often in the terms of the, during the bidding period, it encourages, or most places encourage the contractors or people to go visit the site and get a better understanding of conditions. Because simply a drawing isn't going to explain everything, nor will a set of specifications include everything. And determining by the owner or rep, what are the key evaluation points for selecting the winning bid? So when we take a look at things such as that, we want to take a look at, what are these conditions? What about late bids? So a contractor comes rushing through the door minutes late with their bid. Bids have not been open yet. What standards should be the bid panel looking at? Well, I've offered 4 potential, we'll call it, thoughts here. Refuse the bid. Deadlines pass. Ask if there are any objections from the other bidders present to accept the bid since none have been opened yet. Accept the bid with prejudice. Accept the bid since none have been opened yet, but make note to look on it with disfavor when the bids are evaluated. So I indicate there, feel free to post on the chat if you like. But when we think about it, there are these options. Is it right or is it wrong? All of them are really, in a way, one way to deal with it. The evaluation panel. Well, typically an owner or an owner's rep, architect or engineer assists in the evaluation of construction bids, especially on larger projects. Often bids are evaluated on, and I again offer some criteria: the lowest bid, review of any alternates or substitution in pricing, review of the bidder's subcontractors, review of qualifications and experience statements, or other documentation required by the instructions to bidders. So when we take a look at that, it just, again, gives some criteria. Again, it can vary depending upon, I guess, that selection committee. Evaluation and award of the bid. What conditions should be considered on private projects? A few things to consider include a relationship with the owner, a conflict of interest, value of the work, quality expectations, and past experience regarding previous work. Remember, the lowest bid isn't always the best value. And some people are kind of, lowest or any tender usually is common language in most contracts anymore to say that, well, maybe the person that's second offers something better because they've got, higher quality expectations of the work done in the past. And again, it depends on the language within the, we'll call it the bid documents and instructions to bidders. How about the evaluation of a high bid? Well, there are times when the lowest bid comes in much higher, 20% higher than the budget. So what would you advise? So there are a number, again, things we can think about here when we talk about this is revise the design and reduce construction costs. That's a big setback. Rebid using another list of different contractors. Maybe not so popular with the ones that just basically offered their bids. Have the owner reduce the scope of work to reduce costs. Have all deduct alternates, certainly things of lesser quality, to be accepted in order to reduce the costs, as well as have the owner slightly increase the budget to bring the pricing costs closer together. Again, some food for thought when you think about that. So when we start evaluating high bids, so part 2, where all bids exceed the budget and where the owner's agreement fixes a limit on costs, there are, again, possible options. Rebid or negotiate, authorize an increase in costs and proceed, work with the architect or engineer or designer in revising the scope of work or drawings to reduce the costs? Or do we abandon the project? As it indicates in the bottom, rebidding seldom results in significant cost saving reductions unless large major modification and changes in the project is initiated. So how about project risk? What are some of the risk factors? Unacceptable work, unacceptable installation, quality control, maybe lack of payment, money being held back, not so much the holdback itself, but money held back or slow payments, higher than estimated costs, or lumber prices, a good example, poor estimating, bid too low to complete the work, poor labor, work management, and lack of supervision, delays, longer construction time, delays in delivery, and so on, or perhaps even unforeseen damage, fire, floods, etc. Well, again, we have factors affecting costs. Legal and administrative requirements, the complexity of the project, I indicated that earlier, quality of the documentation, materials and construction methods. Again, not all builders build the same way. Location and ease of access and servicing, scheduling, and contingency for those unforeseen or those unknown things, and in some cases, the actual build environment. So what else is required when we think about costing? Well, we need to think about rising energy costs, material replacement costs, anticipated annual maintenance. So we're going to touch on that as part of our costing scenario. So let's take a look at costing side regarding post-occupancy. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about life cycle costs. So consider the total cost of a piece of equipment such as a furnace. What do we need to consider regarding the actual cost? So we have initial costs such as purchase and installation, operating costs, and decommissioning costs, so removal and disposal. So on the bottom, we see two scenarios here. Furnace A, $3,000 with an annual cost of $1,200. Furnace B, $3,500. It's a little more expensive furnace with an annual cost of $1,100. Although there is a heating cost difference of $100 per year over 15 years, the cost difference ends up being furnace B is actually cheaper when you look at the overall life cycle costs over a period of, let's say, 15 years. So although you paid $500 more, you actually saved more, $100 per year over 15 years. So the savings itself was $1,000. Again, just to kind of give you an example. There are certainly many other examples out there that exist. Next, we're going to take a look at a house that's in pretty poor condition. Again, we're on the topic of life cycle costs, and we're going to talk about roofing materials in this particular case. So if we take a look at this life expectancy of roofing materials, over to the right-hand side, we see asphalt shingles of different sorts here. Typical use and service life is 12 to 25, 20 to 35, 25 to 40, and so on. So when we take a look at the actual manufacturer's, we'll call it life of that shingle, so 10 years, 20 years, 25, or sometimes they sell them as the 25-year life expectancy shingle. Well, it's really not necessarily true. But again, I went to the manufacturer of a shingle company, IKO, exclusion and limitations. Read the fine print. Any damage that occurs during or after any improper application process, including one that fails to follow IKO printed application instructions, is basically you're on your own. Good luck. So again, it's not just the material itself, it's also, we have to think about the installation. Was it done properly and so on? Or is, we'll call it the warranty, valid or not? And certainly I think in many cases they're going to try and indicate that it's not if something was done through improper installation or improper maintenance. Let's take a look at the next slide. Little graphic, maybe a little heavy on the graphics, but along the bottom, we see the service life. We see 5, 10, 15, and 20 years. And if we take a look at the performance, so that vertical going upwards from the beginning to the optimum performance, we see minimum accepted performance and optimum performance. So we see the green and the gold. And what we're really doing here is I'm trying to put together a comparison chart regarding maintenance and service life of a roof shingle. In this particular case, what we're looking at, the service life lost to poor maintenance, that blue line. Likely aging without normal maintenance, okay, pointed out there. And the typical signs of aging around the age of 12 to 15 years in that particular shingle and installation. And likely aging without renewal with nominal maintenance. So in other words, when we talk about a 20-year life expectancy on a shingle, hopefully if it's well maintained with reasonable normal maintenance, it should last 20 years. Of course, there's other things that can factor into it. Wind, storms, etc. Damage that could be, outside of, we'll say, the normal wear and tear. So again, imagine if you have to replace, from lack of maintenance, shingles on a roof every 12 years, as opposed to every 20 years. Isn't that a huge idea when we think about overall cost? So now that we have our house built or our building built, is it going to be a 12-year shingle on the roof, or do we want it to be the 20-year shingle on the roof? And this is where the costing part gets in, is that overall, we'll call it longevity, life cycle performance, and service life of that particular roof shingle. So there's other materials certainly we can think about on this house that's in pretty poor construction, probably fairly livable inside because people do and did live there. And so consider, what about other building materials, windows, doors, siding, etc., heating equipment, and so on. We can think about those things. So when we talk about performance life, we have to think about, does a product meet a recognized test standard? Here's an example to replace old wood siding on that house. So again, if I click on this, it may or may not work. We'll see if I actually get it to work. And I can go to mitten siding. And I go to my CCMC. And I can take a look at it. Whoops, it's got all this junk jumping up on the side here. Try and get rid of it. My Reddits. There's an evaluation report, okay, on mittens siding. And if we go down to the bottom here, there's certainly some disclaimers, but it has been evaluated and reevaluated in, was originally evaluated in 1984 and reevaluated in 2018. So again, this particular siding that we're going to talk, or I mentioned here, is a reference guide. So here's a standard based on the listing. We can determine it was evaluated and tested and conforms to the Canadian Material Standards, which is in the building code. It's been tested. Okay. So a word about building standards. So when we talk about building standards in general, that was one example regarding quality and reliability. Material standards are important to define material quality, grades, and characteristics such as workmanship. Closely related are installation standards for materials similar to what we would call best practices. So building standards are referenced in and throughout the building codes, and most often in specifications for construction projects. Therefore, both drawings and specifications play a key part of any quality build. So let's just simply do a quick recap, review. Key phases. Estimating helps in determining these key phases. So analysis of project estimates, the bid submission, and the bid evaluation. But costing takes into account the bigger, longer-term picture, such as life cycle considerations. So in summary, if all bidders are equally qualified, having a good past build record, and their bids are based on the same set of construction build documents, then the bid price should be the only variable. An open and transparent bid process also in an open bid evaluation meeting provides a fair, truly transparent, reasonable way for a project contractor to be selected for a construction project. So the project build quality control starts with the owner recognizing the ability to get a longer service life, paying attention and considering also performance factors. So again, at the tail end there, I tried to play in that part or roll it in. So it's not just about what the architect or designer thinks. Part of this is also looking at the fact of what material will last longer, so we don't end up spending a lot more money on maintenance. So again, some reference links, and we have what, a little bit left there, John, for some Q&A?
Yeah, we do actually. If you want, I can go through some of the chat questions. So Peter's raised a few points. So they talk about their general contractors. They use a fixed price contract, and change order requests must be validated by the contractor, cannot include items including the scope of work. That's a really good approach. I like that. Peter also adds, cost estimates, budgets for projects are based on history. Detailed analysis that you can describe is done mainly for renovations or projects, which is also, that's a very good comment. And he talked about how the pandemic has increased the cost of lumber, making accurate estimating is pretty impossible. Again, he mentioned again, local estimating can be relied on historical by local contracts materials, and we talked about that in the past, right? We had discussions about trying to come up with a set price, but it really is driven by local construction costs. There is a book, right, Claude, that we looked at that gives estimations of cost for cities. But it's pretty hard for application in community First Nation communities.
Yeah, the RS means is one of them.
Yes.
We also looked at yardsticks for costing. More of a Canadian publication, but it's not up to date, I think is what we found was the issue, whereas RS means almost does theirs, if not twice a year. They used to do it 4 times a year.
Yeah, and the problem we had is that it really takes on the municipality, the larger communities, the largest census tracts, and it's hard to make application to First Nations. So that's where we ruled out trying to use that. I think the best is to communicate among each other. Like Vince has a good handle in Saskatchewan. I'm sure Dale does in BC. I'm sure Harry does in Manitoba. So I think just use the network and try to get a better understanding of cost.
Well, I think also in using a network approach, you might be able to get better volume buying, therefore better pricing.
Yeah. So that's on the chat. I don't know if there's any other questions or comments. I'm just trying to see my screen here. I don't see anybody.
Hi, John.
Hi, Richard.
We're changing up some of our stuff. Instead of using plywood with the mill, now we're making shiplap to minimize our cost and utilizing our resources. I think ISC comment a couple years back, utilize what resources you can to benefit your nation. So for us, we're making post and beams and lumber in our own community, creating more jobs and minimizing our cost overall. With the mill, we have a kiln, guys working up there doing that. So there's an option for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that one slide missing on this, and it's based on my experience, holdbacks and dealing with contractors. So if there's a deficiency, that's, let's say, equates to $500, a contractor's not going to come back and do that. So with the corporation, we had to increase our holdbacks with these some contractors up to 10%, 15% of the project to get them back to complete their deficiency fees.
I think that's a very good approach, and we've been advocating that communities should really start doing that, make that right up front. There's going to be holdbacks.
Yeah.
You know, we were on I think I mentioned a call several weeks ago with a community, and the chief was saying they have 3 homes, been vacant now for 2 weeks. They're starting to be vandal for 2 years, and they can't get the contractor to come back. And to finish it off, they need something like $70,000 additional, and they end up paying out the contractor. So,
Mhm.
you know, there's this whole better approach towards contract management, which you know, a lot of these webinars we've been trying to focus on. So, good comments, Richard. Thanks.
Just one point here. I see a question from, I believe it was Colleen. And for everyone, I will be sending out copies of my presentation along with the recording.
Yeah, we generally, and we also include the links as well as any other documents that, you know, Chloe and I, we usually, after the webinar, identify other documents, so we try to send them out as well. So. All right. If not, I thank everyone for participating. Claude, good thing we got that IT person in there quickly. I always have to laugh when I remember the Microsoft presentations and how many times they bombed on them because of IT issues. So it happens to the best of everybody. So
well, it's probably from me adding too many toys onto my computer.
yes, yeah. So Thursday we have Gord back, talk about again tying into our conversation, housing performance indicators, right, and what they all mean. So I believe that's our Thursday webinar. So
Yes.
until then, any other questions or comments, send them through, and if not, we will talk on Thursday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, bye.